Imagine a strip of land so contested that three of the world's major religions all claim it as sacred ground. Now imagine that same land sitting at the center of every major geopolitical flashpoint of the last 100 years. Some call that coincidence. Others call it something far older. This region has been fought over, divided, promised, and reclaimed more times than almost any other place on Earth. But here's what makes it different from every other conflict zone. Ancient texts described its fate in specific detail, thousands of years before modern borders existed. And today, political analysts, historians, and religious scholars are being asked the same uncomfortable question. Are we watching prophecy, or are we just pattern-matching our fears onto history? The answer is more layered than either side wants to admit. The region most scholars and analysts point to is the Middle East, specifically the Levant. That's the stretch of land covering modern-day Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. It sits at the crossroads of three continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe. That's not a small detail. For thousands of years, whoever controlled this land controlled the trade routes, the water sources, and the movement of armies. Empires didn't just want it, they needed it. The Egyptians held it, then the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, then the Persians, then the Greeks, then the Romans. Each one came with force. Each one eventually left or was pushed out. But here's the part that stops historians cold. Every single one of those transitions, every fall, every conquest, was described in ancient writings before it happened. Not vaguely, not in riddles that could mean anything, in specific language, with named nations, named directions, named outcomes. So the question isn't just who controls this land today. The question is, was that already decided? Let's be precise here, because this is where most conversations go off track. The ancient texts we're talking about are not fringe documents. They are the Torah, the Bible, and the Quran, texts that collectively shape the beliefs of more than 4 billion people alive right now. All three of them reference this region directly. All three describe it as central to how human history ends. And all three contain passages that scholars have spent centuries arguing about. Not because the language is unclear, but because the implications are enormous. In the Hebrew Bible, the land is described as a permanent inheritance, one that would be disputed, scattered, and then restored. In the Christian New Testament, the book of Revelation describes a final battle centered in a valley in northern Israel, a place called Megiddo. The word Armageddon comes directly from that location. In Islamic tradition, major end times events are described as occurring in the Levant region, with specific references to Syria and Jerusalem. Three separate traditions, three separate time periods of writing, all pointing to the same geography. Now, a serious analyst doesn't just accept that as prophecy fulfilled, but a serious analyst also doesn't ignore the pattern, because the pattern has a very specific problem attached to it, and that problem is alive right now. Here's where it gets specific, and specific is what matters. The prophecies across these traditions share several overlapping themes. First, a return of a scattered people to the land. In 1948, the modern state of Israel was established. Jewish communities that had been displaced across the world for nearly 2,000 years had a recognized homeland again. Historians call it one of the most remarkable national restorations in recorded history. Theologians call it something else entirely. Second, Jerusalem becoming a point of international conflict that no one can resolve. Right now, Jerusalem is claimed as a capital by both Israelis and Palestinians. Its status is unresolved in international law. It has triggered wars, summits, and collapsed peace deals for decades. No diplomatic formula has held. Third, a coalition of nations from the north moving against the region. In the biblical text of Ezekiel, chapters 38 and 39, a coalition identified by ancient geographic names moves against Israel from the north. Scholars who map those ancient names to modern nations consistently land on Russia, Iran, and Turkey as the corresponding powers. Right now, Russia, Iran, and Turkey are all militarily active in Syria, that is directly north of Israel. That is not an interpretation, that is a map. Whether it means what some say it means, that's where the analysts step in. Set the religious texts aside for a moment. Just look at the raw geopolitics, and the picture is still extraordinary. The Middle East holds over 48% of the world's proven oil reserves. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway at the edge of this region, is the passage point for roughly 20% of all global oil trade. If that strait closes, energy markets collapse within weeks. Every major world power knows this. That's why the United States has maintained military presence in the region for decades. That's why Russia has fought to keep its influence in Syria, including its naval base on the Syrian coast, which is Russia's only warm-water Mediterranean port. That's why China has been quietly building economic relationships across the region through infrastructure deals. And that's why Iran has spent years building a network of proxy forces from Yemen to Lebanon, creating what analysts call a ring of pressure around Israel and around American interests. None of these nations are there by accident. None of them are leaving voluntarily. And they are all, right now, operating in the same geography that ancient texts flagged as the final flashpoint. Coincidence gets harder to argue the longer that list grows. So what do serious analysts actually say when prophecy and geopolitics overlap like this? The responses fall into three distinct camps. The first group, secular strategic analysts, acknowledge the regional tensions as severe but warn against attaching prophetic meaning to them. Their argument is that pattern recognition is a human instinct, not a divine signal. People find meaning in coincidence because the brain is wired for it. Fair point. The second group, religious scholars and theologians, argue that dismissing the prophetic framework entirely is intellectually lazy. Their point is that the texts made specific geographic and political predictions that have demonstrably come true, and that the remaining predictions deserve serious attention, not ridicule. Also a fair point. But the third group is the most interesting. These are analysts who sit at the intersection, historians, political scientists, and former intelligence officials who refuse to pick a side. Their assessment is this: whether prophecy is real or not, the belief in prophecy is a geopolitical force of its own. When millions of people, including decision-makers and military leaders, believe a region is destined for a final conflict, their actions can accelerate the very outcomes they're expecting. That's not theology, that's psychology, and it may be the most dangerous factor of all. The Temple Mount in Jerusalem is a single compound, less than 37 acres. On it sits the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, two of the holiest sites in Islam. Directly beneath it, according to Jewish tradition and significant archaeological evidence, is the site of the first and second temples of Israel. Jewish tradition holds that a third temple will be built on that site before the end of days. Islamic tradition holds that Al-Aqsa must remain under Muslim guardianship. Christian evangelical tradition, particularly in the United States, holds that the rebuilding of the temple is a prerequisite for the return of Christ. These are not fringe beliefs held by a small number of people. These positions are held by hundreds of millions of people worldwide. And some of those people hold political office, command armies, allocate foreign aid, set foreign policy. The Temple Mount is 37 acres, but the weight it carries, politically, spiritually, militarily, is effectively unlimited. One miscalculation there doesn't stay local. It never has. The tension isn't theoretical anymore, it's structural. Iran has publicly stated its position on Israel's existence multiple times through its leadership and state media. Hezbollah, Iran's proxy in Lebanon, has an estimated arsenal of over 150,000 rockets pointed south. Hamas controls Gaza and has demonstrated its willingness to launch large-scale attacks regardless of the human cost on either side. The Abraham Accords, signed in 2020, normalized relations between Israel and several Arab states, a historic diplomatic shift that many analysts did not think possible, but it also alarmed Iran, and it accelerated the urgency of regional realignment. Saudi Arabia and Israel moving toward normalization, which was in progress before recent conflicts disrupted the timeline, would represent a fundamental reshaping of Middle Eastern alliances. If that happens, Iran's strategic encirclement becomes real. And a cornered regional power with nuclear ambitions is not a stable equation. The region is not drifting toward conflict. It is being pulled toward it by economics, by ideology, and by history that refuses to stay in the past. Here is what makes this moment different from every previous generation that thought they were living in the end times. Every previous generation lacked at least one piece. Israel didn't exist as a state until 1948. Jerusalem wasn't under Israeli control until 1967. The technology for a war that could affect the entire world, nuclear weapons, hypersonic missiles, cyber warfare, didn't exist until the last 80 years. And the global communication infrastructure that allows a regional conflict to destabilize markets, governments, and populations worldwide in real time. That's new too. All the pieces that the ancient texts described as prerequisites. They are all present simultaneously for the first time in history. That doesn't prove prophecy, but it does mean that the stakes of a miscalculation in this region are now genuinely global, not regional, not contained, global. And the decision-makers who understand that are watching one specific development very closely right now: the status of Iran's nuclear program. Intelligence agencies from multiple countries have assessed that Iran is closer to nuclear capability than at any previous point in history. A nuclear Iran doesn't just change the Middle East. It changes every calculation every nation has made about this region for the last 50 years. It changes what Israel can tolerate, what Saudi Arabia will accept, what the United States is willing to risk. And it changes the timeline, because every prophetic tradition that references this region also references a moment when events accelerate beyond the point of human control, whether that's theology or a warning about nuclear escalation dressed in ancient language. The analysts aren't so sure. What they are sure of is this: the window for a different outcome is narrowing, and nobody, not governments, not generals, not diplomats, has agreed on what happens next.